start reading with verse number 6. But now by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law, so that we serve in a new way of the Spirit, and not in the old way of the written code. What shall we say then? Is the law sinful? Certainly not. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law, for I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting. For apart from the law, sin was dead. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. I'm going to stop reading there because I think that that might be enough, and if it's not, we'll read more. All right, praise the Lord. May God add His blessing to the reading of His Word. Tonight, let us start talking about just where we were at the end of the last time that we were together, and that was about the clarity that's beginning to be developed about this demarcation between the past and the future in Christ. What Paul, at the end of our time last week, had brought forth up to our place in the reading of Romans together here, was that that in Christ we have a new way being brought forth that was that had to do with the freshness in this new way. It was something that was not known really before, not something that was seen before, something that was new, novel. This way of the Spirit, the way of Spirit. And if you recall, I spent a little time mentioning that that really should be Spirit, little s, not the Spirit, capital S. But nonetheless, this new way of living by Spirit, instead of the old way of the written, the law is what would be understood, even though in the Greek it just says, the old way of what was written. The oldness of it is not just the datedness of it. It doesn't use a word that just means like something that grew old. It's a little more colorful of a word in the sense that it's trying to get across the concept of obsoleteness, something that's antiquated. Something like this here laptop that's been giving me so much hassles over the last few days. It's antiquated, right? There's an obsolescence in it. And the way of the written, walking by the written law, Paul's saying, is antiquated. It's something that is, it's not just passé in the sense that it's out of fashion, but it's antiquated in the sense that it doesn't work. And so what do we need? We need a new way. Now, why are we going to do that? Why is that what's necessary? This is what he has been working through all through chapters 5 and 6, getting finally to this place to put this understanding in the kind of way that he does here at the 7th. Because the law isn't the thing that can produce what needs to be produced in us. Now, he said some things, particularly in chapter 6, verse number 14, I think I have highlighted there. Oh, yeah, I do. You see there, that's chapter 6, verse number 14. There he basically equated being under the law to being under sin. And some of the things that he said in chapter 6 in kind of dealing with the subject matter of how unworkable and how lacking of the right kind of effect the law is, why it's something that needs to be set aside. When you get to verse number 14 and he says that to be under the law is basically to be under sin, that kind of makes it sound like what he's saying is there's something so much the matter with the law that it's something that breeds sin, causes sin, elicits sin. That's kind of the feeling that you could get from some of the things that he said. So he comes back when he comes to this place to try to clarify that and remove any doubt that there might be over the quality of the law. He's not saying that the problem with the law was that it somehow or another had an intrinsic flaw, that it somehow or another had some kind of, something that was an error, something that was faulty in it. What he's going to end up developing here is that the problem with the law is not the law. The problem with the law is us. And that's what he wants to get to in this particular section. So, he asked this rhetorical question. He is loving those rhetorical questions through the book of Romans, isn't he? He hits us with one again. Is the law sin? That's, basically directly what he's putting forth here. No, it's not. Even if to say that if you're under the law, you're under sin, that doesn't make the law it's something that promotes sin. It doesn't make the law something that stirs up sin. It doesn't make the law something that promotes sin in any way. That's not the point that he was trying to make. But he is saying that sin is not recognized except by the law. So he's going to get into the situation here in the next few verses where he kind of steps into the examples or illustrations that he's making, almost like he takes on the character, a character other than himself, somebody putting forth certain thoughts or thinking in a certain way, and he kind of uses himself as he's thinking through those processes in a first-person kind of a place. The effect of that, the application of that ends up being something that's universal to anyone who believes. So we're not going to worry too much about him using himself in a personal way with that. And what I mean by that is we're going to jump on the applications that are universal to all of us, rather than worrying about keeping everything in the character that it's written in. I. Because he does use I a lot in this section, but he does so, as I said, what seems to be is that he takes it upon himself to be the illustrative person. So sin is recognized by the law. Now, I said it's not recognized but by the law in the little notes here. That's actually the flavor of what we have in the Greek, is that's the point that's trying to get made, is that if it wasn't for the law, we wouldn't understand sin. Now, some folks, when they see a statement like that, and I don't mean folks in the church, I mean folks that are outside the church, unbelievers and whatnot, they like to make the case that the kinds of moral instructions that we have in Old Testament law are not uncommon at all. That these things are understood in many cultures, almost all of them in fact, that there are those kinds of prohibitions, those kinds of statements about things that are honorable and dishonorable, and so therefore there's nothing very unique, there's nothing very special about the law, about the Old Testament in its statements about morality. And I would say that that's true to a certain point. There is the reality that some of the people outside of the revelation of the Old Testament had the law written in their hearts, and so there was a recognition of some aspect of the law that was innate, that was within their own soulish makeup, put there by God, that didn't have anything to do with the revelation that we have in the Old Testament, or in the law as it's being called here in this particular segment. So even though that there is the case that there are understandings outside of the Old Testament community that actually have very similar conceptions of what's right and wrong, nonetheless, I think that the point that Paul's making here is still true, is that without the law, sin wouldn't be recognized. Now, there's a couple of ways that he's going to develop this, but I think that it's more than just the demarcations of what's in the law. So, for instance, when you look at the law, it'll say, it says things very clearly, like do not murder, honor your father and your mother, do not steal, do not bear false witness. In other words, that's really not saying don't lie. It's saying don't lie to hurt somebody. Don't say that somebody stole the thing that you actually stole, or don't say that somebody out of some spite or some kind of bad motivation, you disparage another person's character or what they've done, things of that nature. It's really more of those lines, and particularly don't do that when 2 or 3 witnesses are being called and punishment is on the way. Particularly then, don't do that. But not, those are the kinds of things that are in the law. Is in saying those things, those particular acts. Is this what he's talking about? To some degree, but I think there's a deeper reality to that, and that's just that the law, in saying the things that it does, is meant to get to something that is deeper inside a human being than just your connection to other people living around you, the society that you are in. So, how does he develop this? Well, he says that he wouldn't have perceived covetousness. He gives an example, which is always nice to have, right? He says he wouldn't have perceived covetousness if the law did not say that you shall not covet. Now, this is a good example because covet is one of those things. It's one of the things in the law that is completely internal, right? I mean, coveting, as far as the 10 Commandments, for instance, coveting is something that you could do amongst those 10 that, to tell you the honest God truth, no one else may be aware that it's getting done. Because coveting is something that is, completely internalized. So in that respect, it's a very good example because it goes to something that really gets to, I said he wanted to get beyond the surface of just how you connect with the world around you, the people around you. He wants to get to the nature of what's in you, what's in your heart. And so, covetousness was a good place for him to go in that regard. Now, what is covetousness? Covetousness is an intense desire. You see the Greek word there that's used almost all the place in the New Testament whenever it's talked about. This is the word that's used. You see that nice little epi, and what have I said when you see epi before? You're talking about something that is meant to intensify whatever's following it. In this case, it's the word, you see it there, thumian. That's about desire. And so this is an intense desire, and that's what covetousness is all about. When inside of a person's soul, inside of a person's consciousness, they see something that they don't have, and they have an intense desire for it. That's coveting. And so that's what that's all about. Now, is that something that anyone else could see? No, only in their own self most of the time would they be aware of that. That they would be the only person who is aware of it other than God. So that's what he's talking about. Now what he says here, and trying to make the point about how the law does what it does in kind of like pointing out sin. I would not know what sin was, and if it wasn't for the law. What he's saying here is that it's your confrontation with the law that kind of reveals what's going on inside of you. He says that the way it works out is that in the example of coveting, a person might not be all that covetous about a certain thing or certain area or anything for that matter until something external comes along and says, now don't you do that. And it's hard for us sometimes to think of ourselves as nothing but, children who are bigger than our children. The fact of the matter is that we are a lot like children in this particular respect. In raising kids, and if you ever raised them, you'll know that this is true, is that a lot of times, if you say to a kid, don't do that, that is like the trigger and the invitation for them to do the very thing that you just told them not to do. I don't know if they would have been thinking about it without you saying anything. Maybe it would have not even entered into their mind, or whatever the case may be. The result is just this, is that when you say don't do it, it just touches something off in them that makes them want to do the very thing that they've been told not to do. And the reason I said that we're just big children is I think adults are the same way. Right? At least from my experience with adults, I think very often that's the case, is that you tell an adult not to do something, or that they can't do something, and it seems like they just suddenly are dealing with a great desire and having to exercise incredible self-control, not do the thing that they've been told not to do. What's going on there? Well, that's very related to what Paul is trying to get across in this section. He's saying that when the law, God's law, comes up and confronts us, it touches off this reaction within us. And this reaction that touches off within us is the thing that makes the law not capable of actually producing righteousness in us, but makes the law something that only makes us become very aware of the fact that there's sin in us. And that's ultimately what the law can do. And we've talked about this before, right? The law, it can't make you righteous. All the law can do is point out sin. Well, how does it do that? It tells you what you shouldn't do and what you should do, yeah, to some extent, but deeper. There's something deeper than just that. And when it does tell you what you should do and what you shouldn't do, it ends up touching off something down deep inside your soul that you weren't even necessarily aware of, that actually compels you to work against that particular law. And so that's what he was trying to get to in this particular segment. And it's the thing that ends up being the problem. Now, by the time he gets done with his argument, he's going to make the case that there's nothing wrong with the law, that the law is good, that the law is holy. The problem with the effect the law has is not a problem or a fault of the law. The fault and the problem are in us. And the law, which is good and holy, is the thing that by, maybe we would say contrast, ends up showing us that problem, that issue. So that's what he's getting to. Sin, he says how this gets done here. Sin laid hold of a launching point. Now, the way I have it written up here is very much working with something that would be very literal from the underlying Greek text. So as I was reading all of this in the NIV, you might say, well, that doesn't quite look like what was there, because the NIV talked about sin took the opportunity and that kind of thing. Which the NIV translation is quite fine. It's a very good way to communicate all of those things. I don't have any problems with any of that. But I just think that some of the color in the original language is interesting. So instead of opportunity, like what it says in the NIV, the Greek word underlying that translation is a word that actually means the launching point, the point from which the thing is thrown. And so what it's saying is that there is something, if we brought that into today, now there's always a problem if you do that. Now, like if you take something ancient, like what you have in the Bible, in the original languages of the Bible, and you try to bring that forward into our time to find something that really connects to it, or maybe that would communicate in a way that's more relevant to us today. Sometimes you can end up causing problems doing that, because you always have to start with what did it mean when it was written. What did it mean in the day when the first hearers would have heard it? But nonetheless, when we talk about a launching point, it almost is something that seems explosive, right? Because that's how rockets go off. They go off from a launching point. Or maybe you're thinking of something like artillery, whether it's like a howitzer or something like that. It's going off from a launching point. And so in the modern age, we maybe get that kind of a view. it wouldn't be terribly wrong to see it that way. What he's saying is that the way that the inside thing inside of you that acts negatively or wrongly toward the law, that this thing inside of you, when the law confronts it, when the law comes against it, it takes that instance as a launching point and, blows up, if you will. Takes that instance as a launching point and just exerts a great opposition to it. So there's something inside of us that he'll call sin by the time this is all said and done. We'll get into how that connects with the word flesh here in just a second, but this something inside of you called sin, as a human being, has this ability to, in a sense, independently from your own sense of consciousness, when it's confronted by the law, to rise up and to exert itself in a way that ends up impacting and affecting the way you think, the things you say, the things you do. The confrontation that the sin in you has with the law, when that confrontation comes, ends up being something that launches forth in a repulsive effort, in an effort that is opposition, an effort that is sinful. So that's what he's talking about in this section. He says that sin, and the specific example of covetousness, he said when the command came to him, and that's the way he actually says it in the Greek. When it doesn't detail about how that came or anything else. He just says, when the law came to me, when I was confronted by the law, the sin in me jumped on this the command against the command, and then it outworked. And I use the word outwork there because I thought that was a better way of getting the flavor of what's there in Greek. It means that there is a working through or working out. And so what he's saying is this thing that's inside of you called sin, when it's launching out, it's not just something that is emotional. It's not something that's more like, like a firework, it goes off and then it's done, it's just ashes. This is something that when it launches out, it does so with a I don't want to say a conniving genius, but at the same point in time, that's kind of the flavor we get throughout this segment, that there is something about it that is determined and that is willful, and that it's going to not just make a blip, but it's going to work out to completion. It's going to exert itself until it accomplishes. What's it going to accomplish in the case of covetousness? He says all kinds of covetous. And he actually uses that literally. He says all types. So it's not just like the law came against him or came to him, tickled the sin nature in him, and a little something came out. He's saying that what happens is that the law comes against that sin nature, and the sin nature rises up against it, launches out, and does so again with all kinds of the type of law or the type of sin that's in view. So if the law says don't covet, he says not only do you have like a little snippet of coveting over here or a little something over there, he says that sin nature inside of you just kind of throws a kitchen sink at it, right? Throws everything it has at it, and it comes and it works until it's accomplished what it's launched out for, which is to cause you to act in sin. So, this is at work in us. This is, wild and crazy, I guess, in some respects. But, the thing that, as he develops this through chapter 7, it starts really making sense to you if you're thinking about yourself with a little bit of analytical honesty, a little clarity about who you are and the way that you work, why you do the things that you do. And a lot of times you'll see, Paul says, I don't know why I do the things I do, right? I mean, because sometimes I think we have that feeling when we don't understand why what comes out of us comes out of us. It can be a word, it can be an action, it can be an intent, but we don't know why it comes out of us. Well, here's why it comes out of you, is because inside of you, deep in the heart of you, we could say, is this thing called sin. And that thing called sin is confronted by the Word of God, confronted by the command of God, the law of God. And when it's confronted, it just gets its hackles raised up and comes out teeth bared and just with great determination works to bring you to a place where you are exhibiting, you are accomplishing, you are finishing, and the words that are used in the text here do require a thought that it works itself to finishing. Not just that it's a little tweak. Oh, what was that? Not a little tweak, but something that works itself to a completed deed. Does that make sense to you? Are you still with me? Okay. That's where he's going with all this. Now, he says something very interesting here. He says, without the law, sin is dead. Now, for our first blush, right, when you see something like that, what's the thought that comes to your mind? Well, why don't you give us the law? Right? If you didn't give us the law, would there be sin? And, of course, the answer is that, probably there wouldn't be. But here's the thing that I think is true. I think that it had to be. We can go back to the garden, right? We have the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. Adam and Eve are innocent. They are perfect. They are good. God calls them good. So we know that, at least for them, they're not stricken with this thing that we're talking about. We're talking about sin being inside of us. So God calls them good. So we know, and as we get to the end of this description, you'll see how that connects to what's being said here in Romans chapter 7. But he calls them good. So that means what? That they don't have this sinful thing inside of them. What do they have? They have the image of God, untainted. When we talk about the image of God, that means that they are a replication of God, that their personhood is like unto the personhood of God. The qualities that make up that personhood, the kind of traits that make up that personhood, they are analogies. They are an imprint from what God is like. So if God has it, at least to some degree, in some way, I mean, we don't want to talk about things like, omnipresence. They certainly weren't omnipresent. God is. They weren't. But in other ways, they were very much like God. How? God has will, right? God has intention. God has understanding. Those ways, right? Other aspects that deal with the person of God without not necessarily dealing with every aspect that is God's alone. I mean, if you had all of those traits, you wouldn't be a creation, you would be God. Right? So you're not God, you're an analog. So there's some things that don't get transposed. But, the things that spell out the bulk of the matter, they do. And so that's what it means to be in the image of God. So Adam and Eve have will, they have the ability to make choices, they have the ability to understand, they have the ability to apply wisdom, they have all of those kinds of things, they have some degree of insight, all of those things that are part of God, they're walking in, and they would have been happy, except that what? God gave them a law. And that law was, don't eat from the tree that is in the middle of the garden. He gave them one law. Seems like a pretty insignificant one as well. Doesn't seem like much of a rule. Now, I said that they don't have a sin nature. What happened to them? Because we just been talking about what God's command does to us who do have a sin nature. What did it do to them? Well, with a little bit of help from your friendly neighborhood serpent, right? they were aided in applying their godlike capacities to coming to a conclusion, to working themselves out to a thought, a plan, a conception. Right? It wasn't something that came from God. They were working this out through the God-given capacities that they had. And that command said, don't eat that. But their thoughts said, it looks good for this. It'll help us do that. Doesn't seem like this makes sense. The devil, right? He's deriding the character of God, saying, he's just holding out on you. He just doesn't want you to be like him and blah, 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 blah. Well, they already were like him, as much like him as you're going to get, for the most part. And so, anyhow, the result of it is that they fail. Now, that particular reality, even though we're not like them in the sense that we start off in a fallen sense, we don't start off good. But because that was so for them, under the curse that came as a result, all of their offspring were struck, if you will, with something inside of them that mimicked that, reflected that, reproduced that, was in and of itself something carried over from that all of us have carried into our being. All the children of Adam and Eve have had their fall written, so to speak, into their souls. And as a result, all of us have this same kind of response to the command of God that was first instantiated, I guess we could say, instantiated in Eden. So if you want to blame anyone for that, you can always blame Adam and Eve. But regardless of what it is, I always like to, in my own mind, I think about these things and I think, if I were at Adam and Eve's place, would I have done anything different? And here's the thing is, when Adam and Eve were called good by God, I don't have any place to take the argument. You know, it's like, if I was there, I wouldn't have done it. I think, well, you're not nearly as special as Adam and Eve are. They were good, you're not, and they failed. How could you think that you would do better? I mean, it's just wishful thinking. In a matter of speaking, it seems that way to me. If the very first examples, untainted, untouched, called good by God, failed in that respect, could any of us who come from them have done any different or any better? I don't think so. And there's reasons that I think that it was inevitable and that in some sense necessary. We won't go into those because they don't have anything to do with Romans. But at the same point in time, I think that it's just that particular little stone dropped in the pond of history has sent out its ripples all throughout the rest of history. And because that was so then, we were all carrying around this particular nature. And what that nature is that down deep inside of us there is something that just bristles at the command of God, that bristles at someone telling you what to do, especially if you don't see it that way, especially if you don't want to see it that way, especially if it's inconvenient to see it that way, especially if it gets in the way of what you want. Right? All of those kinds of things. And so we have this reality. Now this is a little bit of an aside, but I'll say it nonetheless because I think it's helpful when it comes to the gospel. I think that the large portion of the human race probably is unaware of that. I'm not sure that there's not a significant portion of the church world that is aware of this. Even though it's right there in the Bible, if they just read it, they would be able to see it. But I think that a lot of times we are so motivated to see ourselves in a higher light than we actually are, that we are not capable of being true judges of our own natures. when I say we, I don't mean us, but I mean the human race in general. I think that we're just unaware of this. We just don't realize that this is true about us. What could in some way or another change our understanding of all this? Well, I think that we probably have to be confronted by the law in a way that's very direct. That the law has a purpose. The good and holy law has a purpose that actually is very redemptive, in the sense that it brings you face to face with the reality of something inside of you that is not right with God, and that just needs to be made right with God, and you can't fix it yourself. You need God to step in and do something about this. Something you can't earn, something you can't merit. I mean, you're already busted and broken. Everything you do is going to be tainted by the thing that's busted and broken. So I always found that kind of interesting. Is that something that maybe would make a gospel presentation more effective? Is it something that is more likely to produce in a gospel presentation maybe actual repentance? Because, that's one of the, I don't want to say beef, but it's one of my big concerns as a minister, of what I've just seen in all my life as a minister, is that so often the temptation in preaching the gospel is to soft sell it. And when you soft sell the gospel, a lot of times you don't get change. We talked forever about the resurrection life, just through the last couple of chapters, and it's pretty sad when you preach the gospel and you preach the gospel and you preach the gospel, and you're not seeing anything that looks different than the kind of lives that were lived before anyone heard the gospel. What's the matter with that? Well, you can say, you need to preach more fire and brimstone. I mean, if the flood didn't wake people up, fire and brimstone isn't going to wake people up. Okay? I have nothing against the occasional preaching of fire and brimstone. I mean, it's part of the scripture, so there's no reason to avoid it. But what I'm saying is just this, is that I think something else needs to go on here, and I'm wondering if what that is that somehow or another we need to engage people with a hearing of the law, so that the truth of the sinful nature that's within them can be stirred and revealed, so they realize that's the problem. That's the problem that needs to be fixed. I'm broken in the very heart and soul of me, the very core of me. I'm broken beyond my ability to prepare myself. I'm broken in a place that all I can look to is the mercy of God and the power of God to change me. So if that's the understanding of the gospel, then I think that we would see something different. And if we don't have some kind of a statement from God, I think, that can get through all the barriers and all the fog that we're capable of kind of exuding into the space, smoke and everything else, right? We can obfuscate the true nature of our own hearts so readily and easily. And it's almost like it takes that fire from Mount Sinai, the thunder and the lightning, that blast of glory, to get through all the smoke screens that we're capable of putting up, to get to the heart of the matter. And when you think about the Israelites, they never did get it. I mean, my goodness, that God loves the Israelites. I'm glad He does, because it says that there's hope for folks like us. But could anyone have failed more than the Israelites have? Could anyone have sinned worse than the Israelites did? I don't think so. I mean, they had the words from God. They had a visitation from God on Sinai. They had all of these incredible demonstrations of God's willingness to reach out and make connection with Him. And they just trashed it all, just ignored it all, just tossed it all away. I mean, I guess if Adam and Eve could do it in the garden, why couldn't they do it, in Sinai? Why couldn't they do it in the Promised Land? They certainly did. I say all that to say this, is that something from God, a word, a command, something needs to challenge the brokenness that's within us. And the law can do that. The law from God can do that. And when it does, it's not doing that to point a finger, and it's not doing that just to make a definition or to put somebody in a category. It's doing that to make us aware. It's hard to look in the mirror and face your own deep flaw and to feel helpless as a result. That's a hard thing for human beings to do. It's a very hard thing to do for anyone with any amount of pride. And my experience with human beings is, man, even the most humble of us are filled with overweening pride. But it's the law of God that somehow or another can get to a place that actually brings us helpless to a realization that we're not right and that we need something that we don't have. And the law can serve that function. Without the law, sin is dead. It's not meant to say that there would have not been any sin without the law. It's merely to say that the law is that test which tests the thing deep inside of us that has to be right with God. We don't stand a chance in that regard. I think Adam and Eve did. We don't. And as a result, the reality is that the law does have a purpose. And when we say that without the law, sin is dead, what it merely means is that without the law, sin has nothing to work off of. It doesn't have the opportunity to reveal itself or be revealed by the law. Without the law, sin is something that you can be oblivious to. Without the law, right, you can just go your merry old way, not thinking twice about it. And if you did, that would be the way that a large proportion of humanity has walked for a huge proportion of the time that we've been around. And the end of that is not ignorant bliss, like we might suppose, right? If the law wasn't there, we wouldn't have that knowledge. We'd be dead. That's bliss, right? No, it would mean, what did we learn earlier in Romans? That even apart from the law, sin was still there. So without the law, sin is dead. But without the law, you're dead in sin. And so it's regardless of whether or not it makes us uncomfortable, regardless of whether or not it pulls the rug out from under us, regardless of not about how it impacts us, perhaps we could say in a negative, self-esteem, self-image kind of a way. The fact of the matter is, that's exactly what we need, because just because you don't have the law doesn't mean you don't have sin, it just means you don't know about it.